Well, let's now turn our attention to Angola. The country has been granted $487 million under an extended fund facility agreement by the International Monetary Fund. The grant will be used to restore its external and fiscal sustainability, as well as improve governance and diversify the economy in order to promote sustainable economic growth driven by the private sector. However, the grant is below what the Angolan authorities were expecting. According to Finance Minister Vera Daves de Sousa, her country was expecting $700 million. Now, this new financing brings the total amount granted by the IMF to the Southern African nation to about $3 billion. Well, let's now take this all apart with Nathan Hayes, an analyst with the Economist Intelligence Unit, and he's joining us live now. Great to have you on the show with us, Nathan. Now, of course, Angola, it is already one of the continent's most exposed borrowers. It is also an oil producer. So that basically means that its debt dynamics are also highly sensitive to, of course, the oil price volatility. So give us a sense of how much this extended fund facility will help the country's prospects going forward.
Certainly, the ongoing IMF program has helped a lot since it was introduced in December 2018. As you said, they've had about $3 billion to date, and last year they negotiated to increase the size of the total program to $4.5 billion up to the end of this year. And certainly that's provided a lot of extra fiscal space for the government as revenues have really been hit this year. And this also provided a lot of policy guidance. The IMF has praised the authorities' ability to boost non-oil revenue this year, also in 2020, as well as cut non-essential spending while prioritizing healthcare subsidying and raising subsidies. And it's also helped reassure a lot of investors. The Angolan government last year was able to renegotiate some private debt, probably with three major Chinese banks, to the tune of $6.2 billion over the next 3 years. So that will certainly help a lot with debt sustainability moving forwards.
But of course, there are lots of questions around Africa's debt sustainability moving forward, and of course the debt trap. And like Angola, we've seen many African nations, they have been pressured into further borrowing, especially in the wake of COVID-19. Zambia was the first African nation to default this past year. Do you foresee more defaults in the future?
I think the biggest risk of default comes from if we see a huge slowdown in trade flows this year, particularly with if there's a further crash in commodity prices. A lot of the debts owed by African countries this year to private creditors, as opposed to official borrowers, and these private creditor obligations are less likely to be part of any debt service relief that might be negotiated. So it could be very difficult for countries with large private obligations to meet those if there is a big crash in export earnings.
Now, interestingly, despite this new extended fund facility, some experts do say that international creditors of oil-dependent nations such as Angola may just have to write off their debt at some point, given the situation. Do you agree with that point of view?
It'd be very difficult for countries to do that. I mean, just the terms involved, I think a lot of creditors would be unwilling to write off the obligations entirely. A lot of creditors like China have been willing to renegotiate a lot of debts, refinancing the terms of reprofiling, often with new loans, often at higher interest rates, collateralized against existing commodity assets like oil or copper and things like that. But certainly in terms of the debt write-offs we saw at the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of those were owed to official creditors, and that made it a lot easier for sort of multilateral action on that part and to be able to renegotiate those debts. But now the debt profile of African countries is very different, and a lot of it is owed to private creditors, bondholders, and that'd be very difficult to renegotiate that, particularly on a wholesale basis, and to have to renegotiate with individual banks and holders of the bonds individually. So it'd be very difficult for a lot of countries to be able to get significant debt write-off at any meaningful scale, and a lot would still be owed.
And of course, there is the debt service relief package, which we saw was approved by the G20 and some of the world's biggest lenders. Now, many African nations, they've been reluctant to take that up, mostly because of the risk of credit downgrades. What's your take on that move? Is that decision paying off for African nations so far?
It's a very diversified picture. A lot of African governments have been very grateful to receive the extra fiscal space that the G20's debt service suspension initiative afforded them. Countries like Angola, they're not going to be able to go to the Eurobond market this year, most likely, because it'd be very unaffordable yields for them. But other countries like Cote d'Ivoire have been able to issue a Eurobond this year. And Ghana have said that they'd like to issue about $5 billion, which would be their biggest single issuance, I believe. And they were unwilling to take up the G20's offer for fear of affecting their credit rating. But I mean, their fiscal picture is quite weak anyway, due to hugely increased spending in 2020 ahead of the election, as well as the coronavirus pandemic relief efforts. So the fiscal picture there is not looking particularly brilliant. And I don't think taking up the G20's offer would have greatly impacted their ability to be able to do that. But certainly, a lot of African governments who are able to issue Eurobonds this year could probably do so on fairly attractive yields.
Quite true. Well, thank you so much for your insights, Nathan. We do have to leave it there. That, of course, is Nathan Hayes. He's an analyst with the Economist Intelligence Unit.